All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, guys, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Guy McPherson, and very excited to introduce my guest today, Sarah Peyton. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you very much, Guy. It's lovely to be here.
All right. So Sarah is a certified trainer of nonviolent communication. She teaches people how language changes relationship and the brain. She works with audiences internationally to create a compassionate understanding of the effects of relational trauma on the brain, and writes about and teaches people how words change and heal us. Her special interest is the way that difficult events impact our automatic brain patterning and how to transform our tendencies towards self-criticism into self-warmth. Her first book, Your Resonant Self, Guided Meditations and Exercises to Engage Your Brain's Capacity for Healing, is coming out from Norton Publishing. In fact, is it already out?
Yes.
It is out. Okay, so it's out. Awesome. Well, Sarah, welcome again. Share with our listeners where you're calling from, where you're from, and then let's go.
Sure. I'm here just north of Portland, Oregon, in Vancouver, Washington.
Okay.
And grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska. So
nice.
Yeah.
Wow. Congratulations. Yeah. Congratulations on that book coming out already. That's awesome. Mm-hmm. All right. So, we talked a little bit about kind of before we were recording. I asked you about your quote to get things going here. Why don't you? I'm going to ask you to share that with our listeners, and we'll kind of unpack that.
Yeah, it's really the essence of the book. It's about making a differentiation between responding to people simply with warmth and responding to them with warm precision. So really giving people a sense of being understood. And the quote is resonance, not reassurance.
Resonance, not reassurance. Okay. So you kind of explained it a little bit about what it was before you said the quote. So let's kind of break that down.
Yeah. When we're thinking about being with somebody who's had a difficult time, or when we ourselves are connecting with a past memory or a self, when we ask people, what would you like to say to this previous self? They'll often say, or what would you like to say to this person who's had a hard time? They'll often say, it's going to be all right. Uh-huh. Which is a very beautiful and sweet and warm way to respond to someone who's had a difficult time. But it doesn't in any way capture anything of the specifics of what the person has been through. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit like putting a very large Band-Aid over a cut and smearing, antibiotic cream over the whole area and slapping this huge bandage on, and certainly warmth has its place, just as an enormous response would have its place to some sort of cut or injury. But what might really be helpful is to clean the dirt out of the wound and give it a good wash and make sure that there's nothing left in there, and to see if it's deep enough that it needs stitches. And it's a bit like that. That's a metaphor for the way that we can bring language to connection in a very different way than what we're used to. So that instead of saying, it's going to be all right, we might say, I wonder if you were really frightened by what happened, and if you're just so needing to know that you are safe and that your needs matter. Mm-hmm. Which is it's just different. Like, what is the emotional tone of the experience, and what is the person longing for? And are we able to make it as ask it as a question, so that the person actually can be in dialogue about what their experience was like? Because there's really no answer to, it's going to be all right. It's kind of like you you get a hug and you know you're safe, but nothing about, yeah.
But that's good too.
Yes,
you know?
It is. It's totally good. It's just not transformative.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What I'm hearing, it sounds so cliche to say this, but what I'm hearing you say, Sarah, is it almost sounds like the difference between talking to a friend and talking to someone you would go, like a healer or a therapist, mm-hmm. or whatever, mm-hmm. right? I mean, and maybe they both have their time and place, but that key word, transformative, mm-hmm. Is very telling to me. Yeah. Let's kind of move on here, and I'm really curious to see how this has emerged in your journey here. So how did you get interested in this topic? And I want you to tell us the story in a sense.
Yes, absolutely. There are two pieces of this story, and one is that I met Marshall Rosenberg, who is the man who wrote the book A Language of Life, the language of nonviolent communication, and I was very interested in his language-based approach to really thinking about the nuts and bolts of communication. And when I I listened to everything I could get my hands on. And so then when I went to hear him speak, he actually had kind of a whole script that he would go through that was very much like his recordings. And so I was sitting there going, gosh, I know what he's saying by heart. I can predict the next word. What am I going to do? I've come to this workshop. Somebody in the workshop stood up and said, I'm going to do an empathy circle in the other room if anybody wants to come. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try something new. And I went over to this empathy circle, and I was working on, at the time we had just adopted our son, who is also part 2 of this story. But he was about 15 at the time that we adopted him, and I could not bring myself to hug him. And I was like, there's this kid, he's come off the streets, he needs to be hugged, I cannot hug him. And I felt so ashamed by it. I just couldn't even tell anybody that I knew that I felt like my warmth circuits were defective. Mm-hmm. So I started to talk about this in this circle that had a bunch of people in it. I didn't know them. I figured I'd never see them again. And instead of telling me what to do, which is what my traditional experience had been about trying to bring anything to being spoken of, they, instead of saying, well, why don't you try this? Mm-hmm. Or did you try breathing? Or have you tried meditating? Or that's silly. Why would you even think that? You know, they started to guess at the deeper longings in my experience. You know, was I feeling anxious? Was I so wanting there to be a sense of connection? Was I worried? Did I want protection and care and safety for everyone? And as they kind of made these, what are traditional guesses in the world of nonviolent communication, they call them empathy guesses. I felt like I was in a boat in a huge storm, and my little boat was going down into the waves of my emotions and then coming up and kind of peaking and hearing these wonderings about what was really at the base of things for me. And there was something about them assuming my good intentions that moved me and started to shift my experience. And all of a sudden, in the middle of this being held very sweetly, I had a physical memory of reaching out to try to hug my mom when I was a toddler and feeling her body stiffen and recoil from me. And the terrible wave of shame that came down over me and kind of prevented me in a way from ever reaching out to anybody again. And in that moment, it was like the physical straitjacket that I had been in that was preventing me from reaching out was dissolved. And I was able to easily imagine hugging my son, which was very sweet for the next part of this story. So I became so interested. I'd never experienced my own neuroplasticity before. I'd never really had a sense before that I could be changed, let alone changed by language. I was just like, wow, this is amazing. What's going on? And simultaneously, the world of relational neuroscience was opening up, what Daniel Siegel calls interpersonal neurobiology, looking at how we as humans are changed by the relationships we're in. So my study began out of kind of this place of stunned delight that it's possible, to move emotionally. And that started on. Meanwhile, this is the second part, and this is why the book was written. Our adopted son, who came, he was homeless at the time that he came to live with us. I mean, he had really difficult and terrible trauma experiences that led to him bringing an addiction with him when he came to live with us. He was really struggling with the addiction. And so I started to learn everything I could possibly learn about trauma, to try to understand what we could do, what kind of therapy we could get him into, what kind of care we could have taken for him, what kind of addiction support might work for him. We did not end up being able to save his life. He ended up dying at the age of 33 of chronic alcoholism. Yeah.
Wow. So sorry to hear that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was about 4.5 years ago. But my search and my longing to be able to understand and make accessible all of this incredible trauma healing material that's been coming out of the world of relational neuroscience resulted in this book, Your Resonant Self. And guided meditations and exercises to engage your brain's capacity for healing.
Thank you for sharing that story. I mean, it's I have so many questions, but I want to go back to really what is the germ of what you're saying. And there's a difference between, I guess it's kind of symbolized in your quote, resonance, not reassurance. So when you were in that empathy circle, it was, they were asking you, you said, they weren't telling you or offering suggestions. What, did you try this or try that? But it was what they were asking, the fact that they were simply asking questions.
It wasn't just that they were questions. It was that they were assuming that there was a really sweet intention and deep value and need that lay below my emotional experience.
They were assuming that.
Yeah. Okay. And really, as I've gone on, what this takes us into what I call resonant language, right hemisphere language. You probably know that most of the centers of language use are in the left hemisphere. Mm-hmm. So as soon as we open our mouths, we're pulled into the left hemisphere, which is the instrumental brain. It's the brain, it's a part of the brain for which other people don't really exist as infinite and amazing beings. They exist as tools to get things done, or functions to support us, or we exist as functions to support them. I am a mother. This is my child. I have to do things this way because this is the way mothers are with children. Yeah. Right. So it's kind of a functional brain that we access mostly with our language use. And as we start to look at what are the kinds of language use that awaken the right hemisphere, the relational brain, what brings us into relational space? Relational space is surprisingly fluid. People long to be understood with warmth and precision by one another. It is our deepest longing to be known in that way. And it settles nervous systems, and it calms people, and it heals trauma.
Can you give us an example of maybe what that would look like?
Sure. So an example of what that would look like would be, let's see, I was working with a young mother who was frightened of her son's face when he was angry. And she thought all kinds of really intense things about how he was going to grow up to be a criminal, or that he was going to harm women. And so I had been talking, she had heard me speak publicly about trauma and about the way in which our brains create emotional memories, and anything that reminds us of any of the cues that were a part of our emotional memory take us right back into that emotional memory. So, for example, if you had an experience with somebody who had an angry face and you were hurt or really frightened, then when you see an angry face again, especially one that reminds you of the original angry face, your body might even freeze from going back into the original experience of the danger. And she said, I think there's something like that going on with me and my son. I said, oh. She said, his father used to beat me. And I said, oh, are you still living with him? And she said, no, my son and I no longer live with him. And I said, well, what was the worst moment? She said, it was the night that the police were called. And I said, well, we're going to step through time and space. We're going to bring empathy guesses directly to the person that you were the night that the police were called. And so we stepped through time and space. We found her. She was curled up in a corner so that she was actually, in the memory, she was 9 months pregnant. And she was curled around her baby, trying to make sure that he would be safe, or in this experience of domestic violence. And at the moment that we went to, the police were banging on the door. So we made everything quiet so that we could make empathy guesses for the woman. We made her safe. We immobilized the man who was harming her, and made those empathy guesses. Is this really scary? Have you frozen? Have you stopped breathing? She said, I'm terrified that my baby is going to die. And we stayed with that. This was happening on a break during a public workshop. And so I was like, wow, this is really big. This is really intense. I was worried inside myself, this is going to take longer than I got. And this seems really important. I don't want to abandon this woman. And I said, how, and so, like, we spoke directly to her in the memory. Do you need acknowledgement that you're terrified your baby's going to die? You really want your baby to be okay? And she said, yes. And I said, what's the next thing? She said, that's the only thing. And I said, wow, how is it for her that we are acknowledging this? And she said, it's really good. She's standing up.
Yeah.
I said, she's standing up. She said, yes. I said, well, see if she wants to come to present time with us. And she said, yes, she does. She wants to meet my baby. She wants to know that he made it. And so we had a sense of this movement through time and space, which is a beautiful kind of narrative encapsulation of the contextualization of traumatic experience or traumatic memory. And I said, well, what happens when you think of your child's face now? And she said, oh, he doesn't look like his father anymore at all. He looks like me, too. He's just an angry little guy. I wonder what he's so mad about. And she wrote me 3 months later, I think, and let me know that it was still, that the work we had done in those, I don't know if it was 3 minutes or 5 minutes, that work was stable, that she was no longer experiencing her little boy as being dangerous. So here's a beautiful example of the way that resonance, rather than reassurance, allows there to be a warm inquiry about what is most important. And yeah, how's this to hear, Guy?
This is really, really good. I mean, it's so just fascinating and inspiring to me that, you've worked to meet people in this way. It feels so good. It feels so good. I am curious as to how you might have imagined a therapist maybe who doesn't isn't familiar with this approach might have worked with that woman?
I'm not.
Or let me rephrase the question. Maybe someone who represented more of a reassurance aspect might have worked. Now, do you work as a counselor, a therapist, a psychologist? What is your background?
My background, interestingly enough, is largely teaching public workshops in the personal growth and transformation world that talk about how language is either relational or instrumental. Okay. And so as I talk about this, then people just kind of come to me or stand up in the workshops and ask that we could have a dialogue with their younger part. So my work, I'm not a therapist, but I think deeply about this and speak and teach and write about how language changes us. Right.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. I guess my question is, I would like to get more clarity on what it would be like for someone to approach this from a reassurance aspect, to make clear that distinction, maybe.
Yeah. So a reassurance aspect would be bringing that it's going to be all right. You'd say, I'm imagining that it would be possible to say to a client, what do you want to say to your younger part? And the client would say, oh, I want them to know it's going to be all right. And then it kind of stops there. Right. Because where do you go from? You don't, there's not room for the younger part to say anything, really. I mean, you might open the door to the dialogue, and then gradually, with enough warmth, what's most important might come out. And I'm sure, the most important thing is always with healing work is always relationality, relationship. So the more trust there is between any provider and their client, the more resonance will find a way through, right? Yeah. Even if what the words are their reassuring words. So, but the more we know about resonance, the more it can move us into these beautiful dialogues and inquiries that let our former selves in the crystalline quality of the traumatic memory, communicate with us about what was most important that has not yet been known.
That's a beauty. That question's a beauty. Yeah. I love that one. I realize we're kind of, I love the flow of this conversation, but I do want to hit on one of kind of an error, a quote unquote error, mistake, or whatever. Tell us about that. Tell us that story.
Sure. So, for me, since I'm working publicly and doing this stuff, sort of live, there and in the fishbowl often, just to let people begin to understand. One of the mistakes that I will make is to assume too much.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you get specific?
Sure. I can.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, if I were working with you in the fishbowl and we were working on some sort of experience that you had that was a scary or painful experience, and I started to think that I knew what your experience was, then I might say something like, "I bet that you were terrified and that all you wanted was to get out of there." And then it would, that sentence ends with a period. What are you supposed to do? Here you are, you're in the fishbowl, you care about me and my well-being, you don't want to shame me, but that wasn't your experience at all. In actuality, you were pissed off and you really wanted protection for any child that this sort of thing would happen to, which is an entirely different emotional tone. And so me not leaving space for you to express what's really true for you, again, curtails the conversation. It stops it. And you might say, "Oh yeah, sure."
So I'm guessing this happened.
Yeah, this has happened to me, right? And so now I try to add that wonderful sentence that will save us all when we're making assumptions about each other, where you hear the period at the end of your sentence and you say, was it anything like that for you, Guy? Instead of just leaving it on the downbeat with the period at the end. Then we're making room for the other person to begin to speak. Yeah, to listen for our own, dead endings of conversations, and to make room for the questions. Yeah.
Make room for the questions. I love that. This is so interesting to me. I mean, what you're doing here, Sarah, what it seems is very specific. Right?
Yes.
It's very, very specific. It's like we're talking about language and how that is used almost to heal, but even more than that, right? It's resonance.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the metaphor of cellos. So if you have a cello that's being played and a cello that's not being played, and then you can put your ear close to the cello that's not being played, and you can hear that it's actually vibrating in the same tonal frequencies as the cello that's being played. And we as humans vibrate to one another's tonal qualities of emotion. And as soon as we make an assumption, we stop the resonance. Because it's no longer a two-person system.
That right there. That's the gold. I love that. As soon as we make an assumption, we stop the resonance.
Yeah.
Man, this is awesome. I'm just looking at the time. We're moving on here. Let me just kind of go back up here. And the book again is Your Resonant Self, Guided Meditations and Exercises to Engage Your Brain's Capacity for Healing.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you talk to not just therapists or healers of it, but all people of all kinds, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
This is a book that's ideal for therapists who want to sharpen their understanding of what relational language is, because it's feelings and needs guesses, but it's also metaphors, poetry, visual imagery. It's impossible dreams. It's swear words, surprisingly enough, some kinds of song. And relational language. When we talk about relationship, we're awakening the right hemisphere. So all of these different ways of using language allow us to sidestep this heavy burden of instrumentality that comes when we only use language to accomplish something rather than using it for relational connection. So it's a beautiful book for anybody who's interested in that. And then also for people who want to explore healing work and thinking about words and trauma. And then it's a wonderful guided tour, an experiential guided tour through all of the different brain systems and nervous system elements that are affected by and changed by relationship. That's why it's guided meditations and exercises, so that you can explore your own brain and your own nervous system.
What would you say, or what do you say? Let's kind of talk about some suggestions or advice here for people who want to begin learning about trauma, working with other people. What would you say to them?
For people who want to start working with trauma and thinking about this work with trauma, it's work that will. It's a basic foundational understanding about language use that will support any modality that you're using to approach trauma. So it works beautifully with Hakomi, with somatic experiencing, with traditional psychotherapy. It's a foundational understanding just about language itself and how it shows up in these processes. So it adds something. It adds a care and precision about that dimension. Mm-hmm. Did I answer your question there, Guy?
Yeah, I need a little more though. I mean, from you, because I guess what you're sharing is so. It's very different than a lot of what I hear. It's not just asking questions. It's not just asking an open-ended question, but this idea of resonance. What would you advise? How would you advise people to think about working with other people in terms of what you're presenting here?
I would advise that people think about working with other people with as much of the foundational relational neuroscience in their understanding as possible. Because the understanding about relational neuroscience allows us to function on so many interesting levels when we're working with people. One of the levels is that we start to understand the subtext of the dyadic relationship itself. We also have words that allow us to begin to give people solid ground for self-compassion. One of my favorite things for people to say to me as they become exposed to this material is they go, "Oh, I make sense. My brain makes sense." For years, people have spent decades just bewildered and confused by their own brain patterns of compulsion or addiction or self-criticism. All of these things, depression, anxiety, all of these things make sense in the context of what brains do and what they're trying to do, and how they build and structure and grow themselves based on the relationships that they have had. So being able to talk about the experience at the same time that we're having it and doing it and exploring it opens huge vistas for self-compassion that were not there previously.
How about a go-to book recommendation aside from your book, of course, which will be able to show notes page? What would you, and whether, it doesn't have to be this particular topic, but what would you say?
Well, Bonnie Badenoch has a new book coming out called The Heart of Trauma. She's the woman who wrote the foreword to my book. And her previous book is quite well known, Being a Brainwise Therapist. But on the 28th or the 12th of November, I believe, her book is coming out, The Heart of Trauma. A beautiful, beautiful book about relationships and the therapeutic relationship and trauma. And she also has a stunning chapter on left and right hemisphere language. She goes at it in a slightly different way than I go at it, and it's gorgeous.
The Heart of Trauma, Healing the Embodied Brain in the Context of Relationships. Bonnie Badenoch. Awesome. We'll have that linked up.
Yeah.
Sarah, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
The easiest, most memorable way is going to be yourresonantself.com, all one word, no spaces, and that'll take you to my everything that's connected with the book, the free meditation downloads that are connected with the book. You can just have the meditation downloads if you don't want to buy the book. Okay. And then that also leads to my other website, which has my retreats and public workshops. Awesome.
Pleasure talking with you. I mean, I realize this is so short, and I know I would have loved to talk with you more, and I'd love to have you back. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this, Sarah.
Oh, Guy, a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right, guys, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I realize that there are a plethora of things you could be doing right now, and you're listening to this podcast. I want to thank you so much. If you're enjoying it, I want to invite you to head on over to iTunes and give me an honest review. I'd really appreciate it. Gets the word out, and it also really keeps me going. All right, take care. Have a great day.